The Lee family. In 1938, Lee Byung-chul from South Korea started with $25 in his pocket and a piece of dried fish. But as of 2014, the Lee family was worth $529.5 billion. This is the story of how one man turned a dried fish into one of the biggest financial empires in East Asia and the world. Lee opened a trading company in the southeast city of Daegu that he named Samsung, which in Korean means 3 stars. The trading company included a flour mill for making noodles and a couple of trucks that could carry fruit and fish to be sold at the market. This was all thanks to the money that he saved selling dried fish. 7 years later, Korea was freed from Japanese rule as the Second World War came to an end. And in the years after the war, Lee expanded the company to make it more diverse. He branched into insurance, hospitality, construction, and electronics. But things started to get really big with the purchase of Dongbang Life Insurance Company in 1963. Then, in the 1970s, Samsung started to build televisions. And according to Bloomberg and Business Insider, as of 2012, the Samsung company's annual revenue was equal to almost 20% of the gross domestic product of South Korea. When people think of Samsung, they think of smartphones and household electronics. But the company has their money distributed through so many more avenues. Yes, they do smartphones and consumer products like refrigerators and TVs, but they also produce batteries, semiconductors, and luxury clothing. Samsung is involved in theme parks and hotels. They have their money tied up in construction investments and natural resources. That's not all, though. Samsung is also involved in coal, gas, steel, and chemicals. And on top of all that, they deal with life insurance, advertising, and shipbuilding. These days, the chairman of Samsung Electronics is Lee Kun-hee. He's at the head of the family, but different members of the Lee family own different parts of the business. It's one huge conglomerate controlled by the main bloodline. In 1956, Lee Kun-hee's sister married into the only real rival Samsung had in Korea, LG, and this connected the two massive companies together through matrimony. The original creator of Samsung was forced to step down in 1966 when his son was caught in a smuggling operation. However, Lee Byung-chul was allegedly the man behind the operation, including others like it. He was also accused of having backdoor deals with the Korean government. So he stepped down, and his eldest son took over the company in 1967. But nobody at the company liked him, and within the first 6 months in his new position, the company had devolved into chaos. When Lee's second oldest son tried to rat out his father to the South Korean government and forcefully take over the company, it ended in failure. As a consequence, the son was exiled to the US. Then in 1987, Lee Byung-chul died, and his third son, current company leader Lee Kun-hee, was made chairman. Still, all the children of Lee Byung-chul profit from the company. They split it, keeping the money in the family. As with most powerful families, they also have close ties to the government. In 1996, Lee Kun-hee was convicted of bribing 2 former presidents. But shortly after, he was pardoned by the president, which means the whole thing was swept under the rug. The Samsung company developed the first smartphone connected to the internet in 1999. But in 2007, Lee Kun-hee once again was caught using money to bribe prosecutors, judges, and top political figures in the country. It then came out that Samsung executives had been trained to be used as scapegoats whenever a scandal came up. In the end, Lee was found guilty and was fined $90 million. He was also sentenced to jail for 3 years. But surprise, surprise, he was pardoned personally by the president in 2009. And after that, Lee went right back to the company and made himself chairman again. And now for number 12. But first, I wanted to give a big shout out to Anime Girl and Derek Teague. Thanks so much for watching and supporting OE. If you're new here, be sure to subscribe and join the family. The Thompsons. The heir to the biggest fortune in Canada was born on March 10, 2006. His name is Benjamin James Ludwig Thompson, and there wasn't a single mention of his birth in the Canadian media. Nowhere was there even the smallest story about little baby Benjamin being born in Toronto. But that might be because his father is David Thompson, the chairman of Thompson Corp. On the same day Benjamin was born, David filed for divorce from the child's mother. And 3 hours after Laurie Ludwig returned home from giving birth, she was served with divorce papers. It was just another weird episode in the eccentric life of the richest family in Canada. Based on estimates, the Thompsons are worth an estimated $56.6 billion as of July 2023, and according to Forbes, they're the 9th richest family in the world. They doubled their wealth since 2015, going from filthy rich to unbelievably wealthy during the COVID-19 pandemic. The Thompson family isn't an easy one to investigate. Type their name into Google and you'll barely find mention of them anywhere. Yet they own most of Canada. The company is utterly baffling, with dozens of companies folded into larger companies, the most public of which is Thompson Corp. Thompson Corp is a digital media empire. They're involved in media law, healthcare, accounting, and even education. They own about 40% of Bell Globe Media through Woodbridge Co. Limited. They also own CTV Incorporated, one of the biggest news outlets in Canada. They own the Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star, and the Ontario Teachers' Pension Plan. But the biggest thing to know about the Thompson family is that they own a huge percentage of some of the biggest media outlets in North America. So it's no wonder you can't find mention of them anywhere. It should come as no surprise that the media outlets they own don't do stories about them. While the Thompson family supposedly doesn't meddle in the content of their media, there's a suspicious lack of the Thompson name in their content. The current ruler of the family empire is David Thompson, the grandson of the man who built it from the ground up. Roy Thompson was the son of an ordinary barber who lived in Toronto. Roy used what small bit of money he had to purchase radio holdings in North America. He then continued to acquire more and more in the world of press and radio, slowly pushing across North America, and by the middle of the 1960s, the operation was international. At that point, they'd acquired holdings in publishing, printing, and television. In 1976, Roy passed away, leaving his son Ken to take over the business. But then Ken died in 2006 on his son David's birthday. Ken mysteriously dropped dead in his office, and ever since, David has been ruling the company. He recently purchased Reuters for $17 billion. The family just keeps buying more and more stakes in the media, but nobody knows just how much they truly control. The Beringer Family. The Beringer family was the 10th wealthiest family in the world as of 2019, worth about $42.2 billion. Their immense wealth comes from pharmaceuticals, and it all started in 1885 with a man named Albert Beringer in Germany. And after over a century, the Beringer bloodline is still in full control of the company. The Beringer Ingelheim Group isn't the largest pharmaceutical company in the world, but it is the second biggest in Germany. It has 145 affiliated companies working underneath it, and around 50,000 employees work for the pharmaceutical group. They produce a wide array of medicine, including things for respiratory diseases and immunology. They also distribute a variety of veterinary drugs, which is a huge business. Back in 1885, the company produced tartar. Albert purchased a small tartar factory and used it for creating tartaric acid, which was purchased by the food industry. This was an ingredient in baking soda and carbonated drinks. In 1893, the family was producing citric acid when they accidentally made lactic acid. It was a hugely profitable bungle for the family, and within 2 years they were producing lactic acid on a massive scale, bringing in a huge amount of wealth to the company. Then, after Albert died in 1939 and after the war in Germany came to an end, the company grew to become one of the world's dominant drug makers. The company is currently being run by Albert's great-grandson, Hubertus von Baumbach. It's estimated that the company would have a market value of about $45 billion if they were public, but they aren't. The family is extremely secretive, just like most elites are. Very little is known about what goes on within a family's ranks. However, it's rumored that the younger generation is looking to boost sales as much as possible. Their goal is to increase profits by about 60% by 2025, adding an extra $28.5 billion in value to the company. The Rothschilds. It's hard to find a conspiracy theory in America that doesn't somehow involve the Rothschild family. The Rothschild family is one of the wealthiest in the world and one of the most influential. It's said that they're so rich that they own the United States of America, regardless of who's president. And according to news outlets, the Rothschilds have helped to orchestrate almost every war since the 1800s. They make war so that they can finance both sides and profit from the destruction. It's said that the family even caused the Holocaust. The Rothschilds have also supposedly assassinated presidents. and many believe they were the ones who created Israel as a country. Nathan Rothschild, who was born in 1777, once said, "The man who controls Britain's money supply controls the British Empire, and I control the British money supply." In other words, the Rothschilds ruled England. The story of the Rothschild Empire starts in the 18th century, and the conspiracy theory about the Jewish people controlling the world's money supply can be traced directly back to the origins of the Rothschilds. In Christian Europe during the Middle Ages, anti-Semitism was rampant. Jews were frequently prohibited from owning property when they weren't being hunted by the Inquisition, and this was what caused so many Jewish business people to get into financing. By getting into the banking business, Jewish entrepreneurs were able to keep money liquid and easily transferable. They could also hide it easily, allowing them to own things even when Christian law prohibited it. In 1744, Meyer Amschel Rothschild was born in a Jewish slum in the German city of Frankfurt. Very little is known about what happened during his early life. But when he was a young man, he became an apprentice at a bank in Hamburg. This led him to the trading business, where he dealt with rare coins and investments. And by the time he was 40, his longtime friendship with Landgrave William, who traded coins with Meyer's father in his younger years, gave him an opportunity he couldn't resist. Landgrave was one of the most powerful nobles in Europe, one of the very few behind the elections of the Holy Roman Emperor. When Napoleon of France started his war against the world, Landgrave feared his enormous wealth would be seized by the French emperor. And according to rumors, Meyer Rothschild was given the duty of protecting the noble's money. It's important to note that the Rothschild family was already huge at this point. They'd made a lot of money by financing Britain's war in the American colonies with well-placed investments. Meyer had also installed his sons in various sectors of finance across Europe. His eldest son, Amschel, was in Frankfurt, but he had another son in Vienna, one in Paris, another in Naples, and Nathan Rothschild was in London. Meyer allegedly took the money from Landgrave William and sent it to his son in London. Nathan then used the money to finance the English Crown's war against Napoleon. This was the beginning of the banking dynasty that would take over the world. By stealing money from one party and using it to fund a war, they were able to collect huge debts from very important royal families. By placing their children around Europe, the Rothschilds were able to secure banking sectors everywhere. Cousins were also supposed to be married to one another to keep the company more secure. But all this fell apart in World War II when Nazi Germany devastated Europe. Much of the Rothschilds' fortune was devastated as a result, forcing them to flee to the US. They've recovered since World War II, seeing as the Rothschilds' family net worth has been estimated at about $1.2 trillion. And to put that into perspective, that's roughly the same amount as the next 9 most wealthy families' bank accounts combined into one. But in truth, nobody really knows how much they make or what they're worth. It could be more, or it could be a lot less. But since the family is said to be connected to people like Mark Zuckerberg and the Pope at the Vatican, it's likely that they're still filthy rich, even if it can't be proven 100%. The only thing about the family is that they're really spread out now. The descendants of Meyer Rothschild have married into affluent families across the globe. Rothschilds have married Rockefellers, Hiltons, and even royalty in the past. Nobody can say if they all get together and plot the course of history, but it's certainly possible. The Waltons. Bloomberg's Billionaire Index says that the heirs to the Walmart fortune have a combined wealth of $234 billion. The heirs include Rob, Jim, and Alice, the children of Sam Walton, the co-creator of Walmart. Before he died, Sam divided the ownership of the Walmart empire so that his kids would have unbelievable financial success for the rest of their lives. Sam wasn't known as a man of luxury, but his children are certainly living the lifestyle. The Walton family has more money than Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, and Warren Buffett. Alice Walton, heiress to the majority of the fortune, was the richest woman in the world as of 2018. She has an art collection worth $500 million, something she has accumulated as a hobby, and it's all from Walmart money, along with 2 other major chains that they own, Sam's Club and Astor in the UK. Walmart is way bigger than most people realize, as it's been at the top of the Fortune 500 list for years. Sam Walton got a degree in economics at the University of Missouri in the 1930s. As a young man, he delivered newspapers and worked as a waiter just to scrape by with a meager living. Then, once he'd saved enough money, he opened the very first Walmart store in Arkansas in 1962. His initial vision was to build retail outlets that could serve rural areas. Walmart was designed to cut costs so that consumers in more isolated parts of America could have access to the quality goods at affordable prices. But at the time, Sam had no idea how huge Walmart would be. The company went public in 1970, and from there, it grew exponentially. And by the time Sam Walton passed away in 1992, his family was the richest in all of America. The New York Times even called him the most successful merchant of his time. In 2005, Sam's son, John, died in a plane crash. Then, just 2 years later in 2007, John's wife, Helen, passed away. Sam's 3 remaining kids own about 50% of the stock in Walmart. But despite having an incredible amount of wealth, Alice Walton drives a 2006 Ford F-150 because she doesn't see the need for a fancy vehicle. Although she's already spent $500 million on art, she refuses to spend hardly anything on a nice car. Even Sam Walton himself drove a 1979 F-150 up until his death in 1992. Carlos Slim. Carlos Slim became the richest man in Mexico by building an empire of grocery stores, cell phone providers, and construction outlets. And as of 2022, Carlos has a wealth of $83.3 billion. Carlos was born in Mexico City on January 28, 1940. His parents were of Lebanese descent, but Carlos's father moved to Mexico in 1902 to avoid fighting in the Ottoman army, or in other words, he was a deserter. After he arrived in Mexico, Carlos's dad changed his name from Khalil Salim Haddad Aglamaz to Julian Slim Haddad. There was a small community of Lebanese Christians that Julian was a part of, and the community worked together to make money. Julian Slim was able to open a dry goods store in 1911, and just 10 years later, the store was selling over $100,000 worth of merchandise. During the Mexican Revolution between 1910 and 1917, Julian used his dry goods money to purchase extraordinarily cheap real estate in Mexico City, and thankfully the real estate turned out to be a fantastic investment. By the time Carlos was a young boy, Julian was already one of the richest guys in Mexico. Julian Slim died in 1953 when Carlos was only 13. Carlos studied and worked at the company, and in 1961 he graduated from high school. From there, he worked as a stock trader in Mexico City, and by the age of 25, he'd already made almost $400,000, which would be closer to around $4 million today. He then opened a brokerage firm and continued to make even more money than his father. In the 1980s, Mexico began hemorrhaging money, and when Mexican companies began to depress in valuation, Carlos purchased them all for extremely cheap. He soon had his hand in hundreds of companies, including retail outlets like Sears and Saks Fifth Avenue. He purchased cement companies and even bought a stake in the New York Times. But one of his biggest wins was when he invested in telecommunications. Carlos now owns American Mobile, which used to be known as Telmex, and as of 2012 he owned 80% of landlines in Mexico and 70% of the mobile phone line market. In 2015, Carlos Slim, as he's come to be known, was the second richest man in the world. But he had a lot of critics at the time, with people mainly saying that he was hurting the Mexican economy. Because of his monopoly in so many areas, there was no competition against him. So, he was able to set prices across the board, which may have had a disastrous effect on Mexican business. He went from the second richest man in the world to the 13th as of 2022. The Mexican government has even been hard at work trying to destroy his monopolies, and it's starting to have an effect. In recent years, Carlos has switched up his strategy. He's still heavily involved in telecommunications, but he's now purchasing real estate. He apparently bought 20 shopping malls in Mexico, then turned his sights on assets in the US. According to Investopedia, in 2010, Carlos purchased the Duke Simmons mansion on Fifth Avenue in New York City for a whopping $44 million. If you suddenly came into some serious money, do you think it would go to your head? Why or why not? Let us know in the comments below. And while you're at it, subscribe to the channel. Now on to number 7, the Dumas family. In 1837, Thierry Hermes was a harness maker supplying equipment to royal households across Europe for horses. His craftsmanship was so good that he earned a name for himself. And just 2 generations later, Thierry's grandson Émile Maurice got into business with a couple of guys named Louis Renault and Ettore Bugatti to make car trunks. But Émile Maurice also started making belts, furniture, and other things out of leather. He took a plain business for making horse harnesses and turned it into more of a fashion business. And the family's company was named Hermes. Émile Maurice had 3 daughters, and each one married into a wealthy family. They all changed their names too, which is why nobody in the family is named Hermes anymore. His daughters then went on to have children of their own, giving birth to 3 new branches of the family. There was the Guérin branch, the Purge branch, and the Dumas branch. In the 1930s, Émile Maurice's son-in-law, Robert Dumas, got the great idea to produce more luxurious items like scarves and neckties made from silks. And when Robert Dumas took over the company from his father-in-law in the 1950s, he turned Hermes into a fashion empire. But it would be Robert's son, Jean-Louis, that made Hermes a true powerhouse. Jean-Louis took over Hermes in 1978. He worked closely with his cousins from the other 2 branches of the family to introduce the Kelly handbag. After 150 years of making silk scarves and objects out of leather, Hermes was in the luxury handbag business. The company made enough money that Jean-Louis was able to go on an acquisition rampage. He purchased silversmiths, crystal makers, and shoe companies, and he added all of these businesses to the Hermes collection. From there, the company's product line continued to expand. Clothing for men, furnishings, and dinnerware were all included in the portfolio. In 2006, annual revenue reached a whopping $1.9 billion, and since 1989, profits have increased 4-fold. After Jean-Louis' death in 2010, it looked like the company was going to be taken over by outside influences. But then 50 family members came out of the woodwork and pooled their shares. And now, nobody can try to take the company away from the family until 2030. Axel Dumas, a 6th-generation member of the family, became CEO of Hermes in 2012, starting an even bigger period of growth with the company expanding into China and Europe. Thierry Hermes' descendants still rule the company as one of the richest families in the world, and together they have a net worth of around $53.1 billion. Gopi Hinduja. Nathan Rothschild may have been in control of England's finances 200 years ago, but now it's in the hands of an Indian-born billionaire named Gopi Hinduja. Gopi and his family are believed to be the richest people in the United Kingdom, boasting a fortune of around $70 billion as of 2022. And Gopi is the co-chairman of his family's business empire called the Hinduja Group. The company was founded in 1914 by Parmanand Hinduja, who operated a small family business in India. But in 1919, the operation expanded into Iran, and that's where it continued to operate until 1979, when the family was forced to seek refuge in Europe because of the Islamic Revolution. Gopi and his brother Srishant then moved to London that same year and began to develop their export business. The third brother, Prakash, moved to Geneva to oversee operations there. And today the group employs over 200,000 people across the globe. But what exactly do they do? They do pretty much everything, although it can still feel a little vague. They're technically an Indian transnational conglomerate, which means they have interests in automotive industries, oil industries, and the banking industry. They're also present in healthcare, infrastructure, entertainment, and real estate. It's all about assets, and the Hinduja family has around $5 billion worth of assets in the US alone. But in total, they have $100 billion worth of assets spread around the globe. The Hinduja family is also deeply connected to world governments. In 1986, the family was busted for their involvement in the sale of howitzer artillery weapons to the Indian government, which purchased the munitions for $1.3 billion. The brothers were brought up on charges, but the charges were thrown out. UK Prime Minister Tony Blair was even accused of prejudice over an inquiry into the Hinduja brothers in 2001, but not much came of it. And in 2005, the family was discovered to be involved in another arms deal, this time with the Sudanese Defense Ministry. The Astor family. For over a century, the Astor family was the richest in America, and their wealth started with fur trading. John Jacob Astor I tried to follow in his father's footsteps and be a butcher, but he didn't really like it. So in 1783, he traveled to America to get his start in the fur trade. He attempted to sell furs to China, but it wasn't that lucrative. Then in 1816, John realized he could make a lot more money if he was smuggling opium instead of slinging furs. In 1729, China banned opium because of an epidemic of drug addicts. But that didn't stop over 100 tons of opium being imported into the country annually. In the early 1800s, the Indian supply of opium was taken over by the British. And John Jacob Astor started making deals with opium suppliers in Turkey to get his own drugs into the Far East. This involved smuggling ships and huge bribes. Between 1816 and 1825, the amount of opium being brought into China rose from about 115 metric tons to 2,500 metric tons. And much of this was thanks to John Astor. But John's money wasn't only in opium. He took the cash he made from bringing drugs into China and invested it into American trade. He used the profits to purchase tea, porcelain, and silk. The goods then went from China to America, where they were sold for a massive profit. But his dealings didn't stop there. With the fortune John was making from tea and porcelain, he invested in New York real estate in the early 19th century. And upon his death in 1848, he was the first millionaire in America. Long before John was rich, though, he married a woman named Sarah Cox Todd in 1785. They were married because she had connections to sea captains and merchants. She also happened to be the daughter of his landlady, which was extremely convenient for young John. It was through his marriage to Sarah that John was able to open his first shop selling instruments, which led him to his interest in fur. He always said his wife was the best business partner any man had ever had. She was right beside John getting rich and would be the first of many wealthy Astor women. The Astor fortune was inherited by John's second eldest son, William Backhouse Astor Sr. Then it was passed down to William's son, John III, and William Backhouse Jr. However, a feud between the brothers resulted in a schism in the family. Some of them moved to England, while the rest stayed in New York. Nancy Astor became the first woman in the UK to be a Member of Parliament in 1918. And in 1912, John Jacob Astor IV died on the Titanic. He was on his way back to New York from his honeymoon when the ship sank. John Jacob Astor V even went on to become an Olympic gold medalist. So as you can see, the family just kind of did their own thing. The issue with the Astors was that they kind of sat on their money and didn't do anything with it. The family split up and enjoyed their wealth as it slowly dwindled. As of now, the Astor family is only worth an estimated $14.5 million. Yet in 1875, they were worth about $50 million. They never used the money for any investments. Instead, the cash was sucked out of the bank to fund personal adventures and maintain an extravagant social life. The House of Satsumi. After World War II, General Douglas MacArthur imposed a massive wealth tax on Japan's landholders, and on October 14, 1947, those of great wealth in Japan were forced to pay this enormous tax. It was part of a plan to turn occupied Japan into a society that was more egalitarian. Landlords, princes, and the descendants of ancient samurai had to fork over a big portion of their wealth. And in the days before the deadline, chaos reigned supreme. Landholders were forced to dump their properties, and rich Americans were trying to buy pieces of real estate in Tokyo. It was absolutely crazy. One of the men who profited when others were going broke was Yasujiro Satsumi. He was the son of a peasant, a man who grew up with nothing. But as he got older, he made some money, and he had a plan. He approached members of the royal family who were about to be disenfranchised and gave them an interesting proposition. He told the members of the royal family that they could live out the rest of their lives in their palaces if they would sell the properties to him. These palaces would later turn into hotels, which helped make the House of Satsumi insanely rich. As Yasujiro's wealth was increasing, he was also becoming more powerful. He served as Speaker of the House in the Japanese government as they desperately fought off communism. He also used his political position to leverage his business, making even more money. And when he passed away in 1964, all that cash trickled down to his sons, the two men who took control of their father's empire. But even with Yasujiro dead, he was still treated like a deity. Every evening at 5:30 sharp, an employee from his business group rings a bell at his gravesite as part of an ancient custom to keep his spirit company. After Yasujiro's death, there was a brief power struggle which was only worsened by the fact he'd been extremely promiscuous. There were dozens of potential heirs scattered across Japan who could have laid claim to his fortune. But it was his legitimate son Yoshiaki who took the bulk of it. In the 1990s, his fortune was estimated at between $9 and $22 billion. Yoshiaki was even briefly hailed as the richest person in the world. You can't go anywhere in Japan these days without seeing a piece of the old Satsumi Empire. They owned private railways, ski resorts, department stores, art galleries, and so much more. Both Yoshiaki and his half-brother Seiji were behind countless conspiracy theories. It was believed these two men controlled the entire country of Japan, manipulating everything that has to do with politics. Seiji would have gotten a lot more money if he hadn't been a communist sympathizer in his youth. His father hated him for it, ensuring he got the smallest part of the business. In 2004, the House of Satsumi collapsed. Yoshiaki had apparently been falsifying the Seibu Holdings financial statements for 40 years. He pleaded guilty to charges of fraud in 2005, and by 2007, he'd been completely removed from the Forbes list of billionaires. Now the richest man in Japan is Tadashi Yanai, the founder of Fast Retailing, the parent company of Uniqlo. The Satsumi family has been all but obliterated financially. The Lauders. The Lauder family is one of the richest Jewish families in the world. They got their start in New York City in the early 1900s when Estee Lauder and Joseph H. Lauder founded a small family business that would ultimately propel them to the forefront of the beauty industry. In the 1930s, Estee sold face creams that her family made in the backyard. She traveled around to hair salons and gave free demonstrations to women. She was an excellent saleswoman, converting lots of New York's women into customers. She'd hang around Fifth Avenue, shoving her face cream in people's faces until they agreed to buy something. Estee is often hailed as one of the first sales geniuses of America. In 1953, she launched something called Youth Dew. It was a bath oil and perfume which boosted sales. What started as a young woman's interest in beauty products grew into a monumental empire. And over the next 2 decades, Estee Lauder helped launch Hermes, Clinique, Prescriptives, Origins, and Lab Series. She licensed her products with Michael Kors, Tom Ford, and Tommy Hilfiger. As the company expanded, she allowed her sons to get in on the corporate landscape. But it was really Estee who was the genius behind the Lauder fortune. And that's why the business is called Estee Lauder Companies. In 1982, her eldest son Leonard Lauder became the CEO, and by 1995, sales had doubled. At the time of Estee's death in 2004, the company was making roughly $5 billion annually. Fast forward to 2021, the company made global net sales of about $16 billion. The family even owned brands like Becca, Tom Ford Beauty, and Glam Glow. Each member of the family is insanely rich. For example, Leonard Lauder has an estimated net worth of $23.3 billion. The third generation of Lauders are all crazy rich too. Aaron, William, and Jane Lauder, all of whom are involved heavily in the company, are each worth upwards of $3 billion. The Rockefellers. In modern currency, the Rockefeller fortune reached $318.3 billion at its peak, give or take a few billion. John D. Rockefeller had about 3 times more money in comparison to Bill Gates today. Today, though, they have a tiny fraction of that, but exactly how much is unknown. The issue is that it's very difficult to track down the descendants of John Rockefeller, so putting together a sum of the total family's wealth is nearly impossible. There are hundreds of trusts and real estate holdings across the globe that will never be put together to determine an absolute number. But according to Forbes, David Rockefeller's net worth is only about $3.1 billion. The family in total, however, could have less than $11 billion. That's still a ton of money, but significantly less than what they had before. It's the difference between being able to afford a pair of designer shoes and not having enough money for a sandwich. The Rockefeller fortune dates back to the 1850s. John Rockefeller's family settled in Cleveland, Ohio. John's father was a traveling salesman, so John didn't have much in the way of schooling, but he did learn sales and was rather good at accounting. John would go into business as a commodities broker later in life. He was happy to make a surprising amount of money by focusing primarily on grains and crops, and John cashed in big time thanks to the Civil War that broke out. Rockefeller used the profits from his broker business to purchase an oil refinery. Then, slowly but surely, John and his brother William, along with their two business partners, Samuel and Andrew, dominated the oil business. And this was the start of Standard Oil. John Rockefeller took over the oil industry, and when we say he took it over, we mean he absolutely dominated it. He had so much control over the industry, in fact, that he became a big problem for the United States government. In 1911, the government ordered that the company be broken apart. So the company was broken into 34 smaller companies. Standard Oil of Ohio was later bought out by BP, and Standard Oil of California turned into Chevron. Standard Oil of New York became Mobil, and Standard Oil of New Jersey transformed into Exxon. All these big oil companies that still exist today are the result of the United States government being afraid of Rockefeller's domination of oil. Just try to think about how much money each of these companies makes on their own right now. Then put it all together into one big basket, and that's how much money the Rockefeller family would still be making if Standard Oil was never shattered. Following the death of John Rockefeller, most of his wealth was transferred to his only son, John Jr., but it was a bit more complex than that. A trust was created along with several other fail-safe procedures to make sure the future descendants of Rockefeller would live easily. David Rockefeller Jr. is the current chairman of Rockefeller & Co., managing the majority of the wealth. But there are still almost 100 direct descendants of John Rockefeller still alive, and this is what makes it so tricky to put together a single figure for how much money the family has. Even if they only have $11 billion, the Rockefellers remain one of the most influential families in America. The Cargills. In 1865, W. Cargill founded Cargill Incorporated, initially as a modest enterprise specializing in grain storage. Today, this agricultural titan stands as the largest private company globally, boasting a staggering annual revenue of nearly $120 billion. With a presence spanning over 60 countries, they employ a workforce of 130,000 individuals. Remarkably, the Cargill family continues to maintain an impressive 88% ownership stake in the company, a testament to their collaborative efforts in upholding their substantial wealth. This remarkable financial legacy has traversed 4 generations, each surpassing the previous in terms of income. Although the name Cargill might not yet be synonymous with household recognition, recent months have witnessed a growing awareness of their influence. Amid a period characterized by escalating food prices and widespread discussions about inflation, the Cargill family has experienced unparalleled financial gains. Following the Ukrainian invasion, 3 descendants of W. Cargill, now in their 4th generation, ascended to the ranks of the world's 500 wealthiest individuals. This ascent led to their inclusion on the Bloomberg Billionaires list, each amassing personal fortunes exceeding $5 billion. The prosperity of these individuals is intimately tied to the fortunes of the Cargill Food Company. The enterprise achieved record-breaking profits amid the COVID-19 pandemic, a trend that remarkably persists even as the pandemic recedes. Notably, in a span of a single month, The Guardian reported an astonishing 17% surge in cereal prices and a remarkable 19.7% spike in global wheat prices. Concurrently, Cargill's headquarters in Minnesota experienced a remarkable 63% surge in profits, mirroring the exact percentage increase observed in cereal prices. Consequently, the company's annual revenue surged by 17% to an impressive $134 billion. So, it makes sense that awareness of the Cargill family's influence and accomplishments is rapidly spreading. How would you spend your days if your family had billions of dollars? Let us know in the comments down below. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye.